I did have a conundrum for you that combined several of our preoccupations. So we've got parenting, we've got embarrassment, and we have oblique and direct communication with adults. We just need to get in like chess and the mind body problem. But
And
so
the purpose of creating art
the
is that
purpose of
the
creating art, right, right, right. Yeah, totally
yeah,
forgot.
we
Though that
can
may be
sneak that in.
oblique.
We'd have
Yeah, that
everything.
may be sort of somewhere in here.
All right, so
So
bring it. I'm excited.
so totally hypothetical fictional scenario, but you're at
It didn't happen. Yep.
your older child's taekwondo belt ceremony, and it's very long. And also at the
Wait a minute. I've
ceremony,
just heard you discuss. I've heard you. I know
yeah,
this whole
this
story.
isn't no, this isn't that story.
What do you mean? You
This
just
is what was
in the
happening in
secret
the wings
episode,
of
you
that
just
story.
what? There's more to this
There's more.
story.
I mean, it's not part of the same
You
story.
could
It's a separate
do
thing.
like an 8-part like investigative podcast. It could be the new season of Serial. Just this. I guess people in the audience in the main feed don't know about this ceremony, but this poor kid almost couldn't get the high yellow belt, which is like a super racist name for a belt. And then he did a kick and it didn't work. Then they brought him away and he only had one more chance and it worked. And then the karate master, sorry, the taekwondo champion told a story about breaking his foot, and then he should have continued to compete, and then he broke his foot again, and he could continue to compete, and more happened at this day
Yeah, yeah.
to present
So yeah,
hypotheticals. Okay,
that's an accurate summary of the entire. Actually, not just that episode, but all of the Secret Show episodes that you have not been listening to. So you don't need to subscribe anymore. But
I just
that's
no need to pay.
yeah,
I
that's what
just
it's all for.
summarized all of them.
To tell that story. The
Good, good
I
story.
was very surprised when I talked to my dad, and I was expecting him to 100% side with the Taekwondo people and like the tough love crowd, but I was surprised like he was completely on my side, which is like a startling.
That's
It was a
delightful.
surprise for me. It was a twist.
That's
He
nice.
said, "Yeah, I would drag you out of there. Fuck those people."
Yeah, fuck those people.
And then I thought, like, oh,
So
should I
what?
have dragged my daughter out of it? But yeah, no,
Yes,
why?
you because your daughter, if you made that whole moment about you and like your principles and
Yeah,
taking her
yeah,
out of an environment where she's felt special and safe, that would
yeah,
have
yeah,
been a great
yeah.
parenting move. All right, but
I could
more
have
things were.
delivered a counter lecture on the spot. Yeah, so more things are
You should
happening.
have stood up. You should have stood up in front of
Let me tell
everybody
you a
and said,
story about when I was a young
"Sir,
man.
sir, I have my own anecdote, sir."
Nobody when I was growing up told me to be a preacher, but I'm going to do it anyway. Yeah. So while all this was happening, my younger daughter, who is much less has much less practice pretending to be patient than I do.
So she's like
But
squirming on your lap the whole time.
she's I mean, dancing around. I mean, not squirming my lap would be that's wishful thinking. But also there was where my wife and her sister, my younger daughter, as she often does, demanded to play with my phone, and I put it on airplane mode, and I like usually I'll give her like a notes thing where she can like play with the emoji on there because there are lots of there are
Sure.
like a million pictures, something like this.
Yeah.
She though has realized that it's much more fun to open up the photos and videos section of the phone,
Yeah,
and
that's more
so
fun.
she opened up the photos section of my phone and she was scrolling through it while sort of, I mean, I guess it was purely out of just naked prurience, but while my sister-in-law sat like not looking over her shoulder, but like directly looking with her, and they would pull up and examine and comment on every photo that Ellie sort of came to. Now, I don't have like sex photos in here, but like I have photos of moles, and I have like every weird image or like dirty meme that Matt Wall or Alice has sent me, like also end up in my photo file.
Oh,
So
that's
like,
so sweet. Oh, Matt and Alice, you hear that? He saves them, he
well,
screenshots them and
it's
saves
not
your
necessarily
memes.
I would say,
Oh,
it's actually not. I mean, it might be nice, except that it just happens without my knowing how to make it not happen. So like they'll send me something in
oh,
WhatsApp and it
he's
just pops up in my photo
oh yeah,
file. So like
WhatsApp does that sometimes, right? Yeah.
everything that has been sent to me or what so like, mostly it's like boring stuff or like weird unflattering photos that my daughter took of me while I was trying to do something
Yeah,
else.
sure. Like
uh
25 photos of your cheek in a row.
yeah. So
Yeah.
but there, as I said, like there's nothing purely incriminating, but there definitely is some weird stuff in there, or just some like medical photo stuff in there. My question
Right.
is like with your
Right.
sister-in-law,
Yep.
not just crucially
Yep.
not your sister, but your sister-in-law directly and
Mhm.
like vocally collaborating with your daughter on examining and commenting on every photo in your phone. How long do you tolerate that activity if it seems to be what is keeping your small child quiet during this long, boring ceremony?
It's a spectacular question. I think that a lot of it has to do with intent. If if I felt like my sister-in-law was prolonging the process or was more actively participating in the process than necessary to distract my kid, I end it immediately.
Oh, I
But
mean,
if I am
the kid is totally occupied on her own doing it. So the sister-in-law is purely
right.
participating for her own enjoyment.
Oh, is that true? It's not like to
And it's like
get the
vocally,
it's
oh,
not
it's
like to
not like,
get your
hey,
daughter
let's do this.
more.
No, no, no. It's like Ellie's doing
Oh,
it, and she's like, oh, this is interesting. And then
oh,
is
that's got to stop.
like
Oh,
jumping in and
no good is coming from
like
that.
making jokes to Joanna and me about the photos on there.
No. And my sister-in-law was and says she is no longer in the CIA as an analyst. And yeah, I don't know if I should say that in the podcast, but that, I mean, I just said it in the podcast. What is she going to do? She says she's not in the CIA. Go look her up.
But is this like
I mean,
that guy
don't
who
look her
did
up,
Confessions of a
but
Dangerous Mind? Like, is she actually in the CIA or was she? I
well, she
mean,
certainly was for many years. And now she has either jobs that her CIA credentials let her get, or she's continuing to work for the CIA. If you want to
right.
parse that, God bless. But yeah, so I would be taken aback. I live in
Because she's seen
fear
much
that
worse.
I've
She's like,
got
she's not going to be interested by
right,
anything in your phone.
exactly. No, exactly. No, but she could use it in some way to ruin me or break me under interrogation. I
Yeah.
think that I fear that I have anytime anyone looks in my photos, I fear that I have like a mysterious open marriage sex life that's combining like
Okay.
violence and
Yeah.
eroticism that I
Yeah.
forgot about, but I have
Yeah. Yeah.
pictures of well documented and in my imagination, anybody looking at my photo will discover irreparably damaging like evidence that I'm unfit to be a family man or a teacher or writer in society. So no, I would end that immediately.
Yeah.
I couldn't. If that being said, I live in such horror of needing to entertain my child for like more than 15 minutes in a
Yeah.
situation that
Yeah.
needs to be relatively calm, that if my sister-in-law discovering my secret pedophilia ring like would
Yeah.
get my like 15 more minutes of focus out of my kid, sign me up, like totally
Right.
okay. But if
Yeah.
my kid alone would be distracted on the app, I and my sister-in-law is looking over his shoulder for reasons that don't benefit the kid, that's got to end immediately.
I tolerated it for about 2 whole minutes, which was like
No,
she was just
it's
gritting
you're
teeth
a
the whole time.
you can't, because right, you're waiting for her to discover something horrible even though you know that
Yeah.
nothing horrible is there. There's no
Can I tell you
nothing good
the
about
best? I
that.
think what I realized is the best photo on there was Matt Wall sent me a photo of the cover of his new book, which is a book called Poems About Fucking. And the cover is metallic and shiny. Like it's very shiny. It's like slightly distorting, but it's very, very shiny. And I realized
Like
he took the photo like this, holding it in front of himself while he was not wearing a shirt. And so
no.
in the middle of the reflective cover is a big like gender non-specific nipple.
You
It's
think
like
he pretended to do that accidentally, but that
it's
was the
hard to
intent,
tell. I mean,
like
I was gonna say the book before that had a picture of him on the toilet, so I like it's hard to know what's accidental.
sounds like a
I was to me it was
good
like
cover.
comparable to like sitting very close to someone who is eating something loud.
No, family is complicated.
Lovely people
Yeah,
all, except
they're
maybe
great.
yeah.
Your
Uh,
sister-in-law and mine are great people. who've done great work for the country, who
Yeah.
have arranged for the murder of the appropriate people. You know what I mean?
Appropriate democratically elected socialist leaders of Latin
Yeah.
American countries.
No, no,
Yeah.
no, not necessarily. I'm saying that whoever was murdered based on the behavior of your sister-in-law and mine
Mhm.
should have been murdered.
One of the sister-in-laws, just
No, I'm just
just the
grouping them together. I'm
yeah,
saying
that's right.
if you take all the people murdered
Mhm.
because of the decision making process by our sisters-in-law, those people murdered they should have been murdered.
You could almost call it
Yeah,
a
a legacy
morally
of ashes.
necessary torture murder
And if they suffered
protocol.
beforehand, then they deserve to suffer.
Yeah,
The
well, and the suffering
victims,
was
not the
for
victims.
the benefit
Initially
of
the
the
perpetrators
yeah,
for the country,
yeah.
for the country. Their suffering helped our great country.
Is Havana syndrome real, or is
No,
it made up?
it's pretend.
I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you all for listening. Thank you especially to any of you who've taken a moment sometime this week to recommend the show to a friend, especially if you are at AWP. I can't make it this year. My wife Joanna is there, so go buy her a shot of tequila if you see her. I know a number of listeners are going to be there. I hope you all have a great time, and spread, tell the cool people there. Tell the select number of AWP attendees about the show. We don't want narcs. We don't want, I don't know. I'm not sure who we don't want listening. The Poetry Foundation. The problem is I've just interviewed like 2 Poetry Foundation people, and they were both super nice. So I don't know. Tell anybody you like about the show. And most of all, have a good time with the off-site events and extramarital affairs and excessive drinking. I mean, that all of that sounds great. It's the actual scheduled panels that just sound dreary. And God help any of you who've gone for job interviews. I mean, I truly wish you luck, but boy, that just sounds miserable. So enjoy sunny Seattle. I think it may be a little breezy out there right now. At any rate, thank you all for listening. We're closing on an episode 100. I promise I'm not going to make a big to-do out of it because, as I've already mentioned, nobody gives a shit about episodic milestones other than the actual podcaster. But this is episode 99, and I thought I just put out a sort of an extra long, extra poetry focused episode. So I thought I would go back to another sort of Slee Ricketts staple. I have for you today a conversation Brian and I had. We are back on Senior Watch. Jen Senior was out for a little while. She's had long COVID. She still has long COVID, but she seems to be back. She's putting out new essays at the Atlantic, and we talk about not one but 2 of them today. So we started with Jen Senior, and we're going to keep covering Jen Senior as long as she does not file a cease and desist order. It was a long conversation, so I am probably going to put the second half of it about the second essay in the secret show. But it was a lot of fun. It's great as always talking to Brian. I should mention I also got a lot of really rich, provocative, thorny, interesting, lovely correspondence from a lot of people. If I've not responded to yours yet, it's because I'm planning to talk about it on an upcoming Secret Show episode. So I will also try to get that out soon. And then the only other thing I'll say about episode 100 is I have a specific idea for it, and it's going to be poetry focused. But I think it'll also be sort of fun for a general audience, I hope. Anything else I need to mention? Oh, right. If you would like to hear that or the second half of this conversation or any number of other auditory delights, then go to sleeverickets.substack.com and sign up for the secret show. You just put your email address in, and I'll give you a week's access for free. There's 33 episodes up there now. They're all pretty juicy. A monthly subscription is just $5. An annual subscription is, you get 2 of those months for free, basically. So it's all pretty cheap. And I put out about 3 episodes a week, though I think last month I put out 4, just as a little extra something for all of you. All right. to my conversation with Brian.
My kids' school has the parents in action meeting group where you meet all the first parents or all the third grade parents go, and it's not all of them, it's the ones who want to show up. So a third of the first grade parents come up to this room, and it's facilitated by the parent of a comparably aged kid at a different school. And the goal is to get a sense of what other parents are feeling and dealing with, but it turns into this performance of vulnerability where you say, like, has anyone else been dealing with this issue? And no one says the actual severity of the issue because no one wants their kid to seem like an idiot or a cruel person whose friend wouldn't you want your kid to become. So it's never like my kid says racist things at home, what do I do? It's always like, does anybody else's kid not want to do the extra credit assignments? And everyone's like, oh, those extra credit assignments, or like, does anyone else's kid not show the right amount of
enthusiasm
sympathy when passing a homeless person, and it's like, oh, I know it's so hard. And I love that. I loved watching people attempt to demonstrate like just enough vulnerability, but withhold the actual like difficulties in their life.
Oh, so you see it as less like what, like my greatest flaw is that I am a perfectionist. You see it less as like
that. No, I see it as something far more complicated than that.
It's like a way to, it's like proxy honesty where you're like, I need some sharing vulnerability, but I can't actually be vulnerable.
And I want to be seen as human and sharing vulnerability, so the other moms in the moms group will sort of understand that I suffer like they do. So it's just this fascinating balance of like, it really is hard to get credit assignments, and we can discuss even whether there should be homework or whether there should be extra credit assignments, but like sitting down with your kid, wanting your kid to be the sort of kid who wants to do the extra credit assignments and trying to trick your kid into becoming that sort of kid is, I think, a worthwhile, interesting enough conversation. But the theoretical purpose of this meeting is for all of us to realize that we're not alone and that our kid throws massive tantrums and says they hate us repeatedly, but nobody's going to say that. So it's these, baby steps towards that, which is just a game I love to play.
So do you think I'm violating a social norm when another parent in the neighborhood asks me some innocuous question and I tell them that Ellie throws constant temper tantrums, screaming she hates us? Like, am I actually?
No, I think you're giving them exactly what they want. I think you're giving them exactly what they want. Right. And it's funny because I wonder sometimes why I am not more forthcoming. And I think it is, I think my fake answer is because I teach at the school and I don't want these people to think that I, as a teacher, am not qualified or bad or unprofessional or something. But I think the truth is that I am into the same fears that they are, that I don't want them to think of my kid as a fuck up, and I don't want them to see me as a bad parent. And surrounded by this small group of kids whom my kid is going to grow up with for 7-8 years, I think I want them to see him in a kind light, and I'm not about to show our dirty laundry any more than anybody else is.
So you're more vulnerable to vicarious embarrassment than personal embarrassment. Like, that's something that you experience more than you experience. Like, if it were just about you and your shortcomings, it would bother you less.
Yeah, I don't care what they think about me.
Right.
Except maybe in this one specific professional context. Sure. I do care what they think about my kid. And maybe you could say my kid is just a reflection of me and I want to be seen as a good parent. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I'm not self-aware enough to know.
I don't quite buy that. I think it does a different.
But tantrums are easy to talk about. Like the only way I'd push back is I absolutely talk about my kids throwing, even now when they're too old to throw tantrums, because that is we don't understand tantrums fully. It seems like a neurological phase
from a god or something, where you're like,
exactly. Whereas
a branch fell on our house.
Right. Whereas if the story is my kid coming home and saying like, why do I have to play with the poor kids? I don't want to
Right.
be
Right.
at their
Yeah.
poor
Yeah.
people houses. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wouldn't tell that story. And would I not tell it because I wouldn't want them to know my kid? And that didn't happen. But
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
would I not want to tell that story because I wouldn't want them to think my kid's an asshole, or that I raised a kid who's an asshole? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
There are very few things that I know I ought to be embarrassed by that I am not embarrassed by. The only time I am more forthcoming than average is when I don't realize I should be embarrassed about something. I was slightly embarrassed this morning. I mean, partly because I was looking at nonsense on my phone, which I, like not having social media, I'm reduced to like playing chess or occasionally looking up like Apple News, which is the worst.
I know it's the
But
worst. I do too.
I had a terrible moment where I saw an Atlantic article that wasn't like locked, and it had some vague kind of existentially themed title. I was like, oh, something in Atlantic about who you are, why and I tapped on it, and it opened up, and then I just immediately saw it was a poem and went and clicked back. Like, didn't read it, didn't even look at who the poet was. Just like that it was a poem. I was like, what a bait and switch. This is the last thing I want to look at.
God, who would want to spend their free time reading a poem?
Right. Yeah.
Instead, I thought I was reading Arthur Brooks's Four Secrets to Happiness. How does Arthur Brooks have a new Four Secrets to Happiness every week? I don't understand how
What a
there are
charlatan
four
that
new
man is.
secrets.
Though I think he seems to somehow
Oh
genuinely
man.
believe in his own nonsense.
Well, it helps that he is like a Harvard professor of
Oh
psychological
yeah.
four ways to be happy. Like
Right. Yeah.
I think that if you are idolized enough by people within the academic world, as we've discussed in the past, maybe it makes it easier to believe your own charlatanism.
Yeah. I sensed oddly a little bit of that getting ahead of ourselves in some of the Gen Senior stuff.
Well, let's discuss the
Yeah,
Gen Senior
we're back
stuff.
on Gen Senior beat with a double header,
Double
smallish double
senior.
header. Yeah, double senior. Yeah. So you sent me this piece, "What Not to Ask Me About My Long COVID," which was also titled "An Etiquette Guide for Long COVID" in some formats. And that does seem to be like not just an editorial title, because she as much as says explicitly that like she wants this to be an etiquette guide for long COVID. So
I thought a few things. I thought that I felt bad for Jennifer Senior. She seems to be really suffering, and I felt pretty profound empathy for her as well, because a lot of the ways that she suffers are identical to the ways that I suffer. I don't think we've ever done this fully. So should I take a moment now and just like give
sure,
the
yeah, yeah,
1 or 2 minute version
yeah.
of
I
what
wondered when
happened
she mentioned
to
Meniere's
me?
disease, which I imagine was something you at some point heard about in your yeah.
Yeah. So and ruled out. So I smoked pot a decade ago or so now, and I was dizzy for a day, and then it didn't go away for a week or a month, and then it did go away. And then 6 months after that, I got I was dizzy again for a day, and it was unclear why. So I got a battery of tests. One of the tests was a test where they pump hot water into your ear at various pressures to determine your vestibular system's reaction to it, and that made me that was a trigger, as it is apparently to a lot of people, and reoriented my vestibular system in some way, where I became dizzy every day for 6 months after that. And dizzy, it's not vertigo, the room's not spinning, but it's a feeling of disequilibrium. I couldn't get out of bed for pretty much a year and a half, and I couldn't work for 2 years. It finally, I got it under control. But the side effects, one of the medications I was taking was that I had really bad nightmares every night, and the symptoms went away. So I thought I could cut that medication. I cut down on it, and the symptoms were still gone, but the nightmares were there. I cut down on the symptoms were still gone, but the nightmares were there. And then I got off of it entirely. At which point the symptoms came back. This was just after the birth of my second kid, and we how to find medication that worked again, because once I went back on that medication that led to the nightmares, it was completely ineffective. Another round, considerably longer this time, of absolute incapacitation. So after my second son was born, I felt every morning as though I had just drunk, 30 beers or 30 glasses of wine or something upon waking up. I couldn't see out of my left eye. I couldn't walk straight. I only went to doctors. I couldn't talk on the phone. I tried all sorts of charlatans. So I wrote an article about this for the Times and received literally thousands of responses giving me suggestions of what might mitigate the symptoms. Because there are thousands and thousands. I think I estimate a few 100,000 people with undiagnosed dizziness in the United States, so I tried all of the suggestions, and I'm a cynic.
These were like welcome at this point.
Right. I mean, I was hungry for them.
Yeah.
So I tried uh everything from, an herbalist to acupuncturist to chiropractors. I had somebody test my blood and then tell me what foods I shouldn't eat. So for 4 months, in addition to having the room spin, I mean, having my balance all fucked up, I didn't eat dairy or gluten or soy or caffeine, alcohol, or anything that's fermented, anything with processed sugars, anything that was treated in any way. So I essentially had sort of baked proteins and rice exclusively for food for years. I got very, very depressed, not surprisingly, and it took 3 years to get me to the place where I could again be alone with my kids without fear of them, needing me and my being unable to help. During that time, I saw every specialist in the country and in other countries. Finally, a specialist in a University of Pittsburgh sent me to a colleague at the Mayo Clinic who said, "Oh, we do occasionally see things like this undiagnosable dizziness. It fell under the category of PPPD, persistent positional dizziness, for which I was prescribed 3 medications, a blood pressure medication called verapamil, even though I have low blood pressure normally, an anxiety medication called Xanax, and a antidepressant called Zoloft. I am now on huge quantities of all 3 of them, and I have vicious, horrible nightmares every night from the Zoloft, as well as constipation from the verapamil, and fatigue from the Xanax. But it's far, far better from not being able to live again. So I give every week multiple emails still from those articles I wrote 4 and 7 years ago for the Times, saying, I have some version of what you have, and my doctors dismiss me because they think, people are just dizzy and you'll get over it. And I'm reminded frequently how lucky I am to have found some solution, because there's so many people out there without it. So I have lived through this long COVID media cycle, zeitgeist, but like actual experience, that some friends have had, but mostly strangers, with this horror, seeing everybody experience some version of what I've experienced for the last, feeling very, very lucky myself that I have found a way to live life again, to teach and write and talk to you on a podcast and be with my kids, none of which could I have done for long periods of my life. And what Jennifer Senior mentions, which was definitely the case, is that the depression is twofold. It's depression caused by the symptoms, where it's, something's wrong with, in my case, the interaction among my vestibular system and my brain and I guess the vestibular system consists of inner ear and brain and nerves. So something in that system is out of whack for me, and I'm trying to deal with it. But her talking about how siloed medical professionals are, whereas you go to the ear doctor who tries to see if you have Meniere's disease, and then you go to the eye doctor who sees if corrective lenses will help, and you go to the heart doctor who sees if blood pressure medication will help. All of that mirrored my experience exactly. So I have myself now, I've got 6 pretty good hours of clarity every day, from the hours of 8 to 2 or so, and then I start to fall apart neurologically. But I'm very, very grateful for those 6 hours. I remember the real horror and depression being, which Jennifer Senior just touches on but doesn't really get into. It's the uncertainty of how long this horror is going to last, where this is something that you and I have touched on in the show briefly, where, like, if I had known that I just broke my leg and I was going to experience terrible leg pain for a day, a week, or a year, or 5 years, or I would have to re-break my leg every day for 5 years and deal with that terrible pain. That would be okay if I knew at the end of those 5 years it would be over.
Right.
What's so
Yeah.
scary in the middle of it is thinking like, not only is my life fucked, not only am I unable to work or be parent or be a spouse or caretaker or achieve any of the minor or major goals, but I don't know whether this is going to last 2 weeks or 2 years or 20 years or the rest of my life. And that combination is particularly vicious. And I think people dealing with long COVID right now, Jen Senior, because she wrote about this, but a lot of other people are in that world where they're not certain. It's very hard to differentiate between the anxiety of dealing with the symptoms, the anxiety from not knowing how to talk about the symptoms and other people treating you differently, and the anxiety of not knowing if this is going to last forever. That anxiety redoubles and triples and sort of makes more severe the symptoms. And then you're in this world of uncertainty and pain. I think Jennifer Senior saying she's got an etiquette guide, little bit coy of her, but I understand that sometimes it's easier to talk about etiquette than it is the very complicated, muddled, intertwined nature of the various sufferings.
So I think, like you, I found her description of her experience with long COVID extremely sympathetic and familiar from, I have a family member who went through something similar with having to like radically alter her diet for years at a time, and had 20 different definitive answers given to her, as well as lots of doctors telling her there was nothing wrong, and then sort of finally got an unpleasant but like satisfyingly specific diagnosis that seems to be correct and now at least treatable in a coherent way. And I've had I had a pituitary tumor that I think similarly, like it was the sort of thing where if I had two drinks in a night, then I would wake up feeling like, I mean, just like vomiting, like feeling like my head was on fire and I was sick to my
Yeah.
stomach with the worst hangover I'd ever had. And had a few little episodes like that before they found the little mass, and there were hormone elements, but it was much shorter lived and less and like more easily addressed problem because they could just go in and cut it out, and I take a little drug to keep it in check. But it was a much smaller version of that crisis. But I think everything she said about going to a million doctors, being condescended to by the doctors, having each doctor decide that it's the nail that matches his particular hammer, and having to take a fistful of meds that some of which seem to
Absolutely. And what you say,
contradict each other.
two things. One, on the fistful of meds front, what was fun is the one holistic doctor who made me take thousands of percentage of what normal daily intake of calcium was, which led immediately 6 months later to a horrible kidney stone attack. Because like he just like put all this calcium in my kidney. So don't like that guy. But the other thing you said about doctors who either have no idea what's going on or are certain and incorrect.
Yeah.
I am, since all of this, I am so much more open to a doctor who says, not sure what's happening,
Oh
don't know,
God.
let's try some stuff. And then that certainty, that
Yeah.
medical
Yeah. Yeah.
certainty
Jesus.
is
Yeah.
to me a particularly vicious type of certainty.
Yeah.
And she, it's funny, hints at it with a parenthetical. In fact, the fact is, she writes, no one, including doctors, it's actually a parenthetical inside M dashes. So the fact is, comma, no one, M dash, including doctors, open paren, is doctors, comma, dear God, these doctors, close paren, close M dash, knows the right thing to say to those of us who have long COVID. I do, Jen, I do think the more open you are to empathy towards Jennifer Senior, the more her sort of wacky writing style I could tolerate, because I knew exactly what she meant by
Oh
doctors,
yeah.
especially dear God, these
But it
doctors.
wasn't
But
especially
it's
clear
it's
writing.
no, exactly. So it's there's something delightful about like perfectly understanding unclear writing, which is a
Yeah.
pleasure to have when she was talking about the 9/11 trutherism, with that piece that
Right.
won her the Pulitzer a year or two ago. But anyway, but yeah, she refers to doctors and just like dismisses them out of hand in a delightful way to me. We're like, we all know doctors are unbearable, moving, but
Right.
like, do we all know that? I guess enough of us do that you can get away with that.
Yeah. No, I completely could relate to that. And I think, like you, I've come to be really grateful to people like my general practitioner, who is very good at coordinating specialists, but also is just sort of generally like curious and clearly very, very smart and very knowledgeable, but seldom totally certain about things she says, and tends to be pretty like open-minded about what's possible. Because I think so, like medicine,
So
to like being a doctor is like knowing a colossal amount of information in a field that has such like even more unfathomably,
an infinite
vast,
amount of
yeah,
right,
right,
right. Um,
information to know.
so
Yeah, so but there's sort of they're like there's the description of her experience part of this essay, which I think both of us found sort of moving and to varying degrees familiar and totally sympathetic. And then there's the ostensible purpose of the essay, which is the etiquette guide to COVID. And I had sort of two big objections to that, but I'm
which
curious
I'm
how you
really
responded
interested
to it.
in hearing,
Yeah,
because I when I read these pieces, as is the case when usually people read things that they are experts in, I thought I would have a lot of frustration and
yeah,
dismissiveness in reading it, but all of this pretty much rang true to me. So I think you and I might disagree on some of this. So
sure.
what did you feel was off-putting in terms of her advice?
First, let's identify the actual advice. because like my I mean my
It,
first objection is sort of a formal one, which is like, had this just been the title, then I would assume it's something that editor slapped on. But she does explicitly say, so today I'd like to discuss etiquette. That's right, manners. I'd like to officer my thing can't read F's. I'd like to offer a civilian's guide to navigating the sensitivities of those furious, frustrated, irritable millions and to better understanding them. So she then goes on to say, for starters, asking, "Are you doing any better?" doesn't help. And she talks about, she says, it's better to say, "How are your symptoms today?" So that's a piece of advice number one. She goes on to say,
to me, that was pretty much the only piece of advice.
yeah, there's one more, maybe specific one. I'm trying to find it.
Don't be
Um,
a huge asshole seems like one of the pieces of advice, because she mentions telling somebody that she wants to leave a party because it hurts to talk, and then that person keeps on asking her very pointed questions.
yeah, or
So that
the New York Times editor who was just a total psychopath to her.
right, like a very
Yeah.
cruel, if you don't say very cruel things to people
Like
with
no human being
with
should
long
ever
COVID.
say. Or oh, and then she says, "Don't ask what it's like to have long COVID." And then I guess the other thing she says is, if you encounter them. So the one paragraph that I thought was pretty inarguably good and clear wisdom, it's sort of a little too broad to be advice, was the last one. She says, talking about if you encounter someone with long COVID, she says, if you encounter them, remember that they are suffering. Remember that they don't want to be pitied. Remember that they've each developed their own idiosyncratic strategies to cope, and that they don't need to be told to do more or less or to approach things differently. Be gentle. Disease eventually ensnares all of us. When it happens to you, you'll crave the same. So, my formal objection is like, if part of the reason to write this as an etiquette guide is to make it more delicious to read, then like what I want when I go to an etiquette guide is a list of specific things to do and not do. And like as an
Right. So
etiquette guide, this is totally not what it purports to be. So like that's just like a
I
formal
to-
objection.
totally agree with that. That her only real piece of etiquette, which I agree with, is not constantly asking the sufferer if the sufferer is getting better. Because if you ask the sufferer is getting better, the sufferer needs to constantly feel like, I am disappointing you in saying, no, I am not getting better. And I am needing to focus on the fact that I'm not getting better. So there are ways of checking in. And when I was really at my worst in those 2.5 years, the first 2.5 years of Sam's life, I guess, I remember being just irate with people who checked in every day saying, are you feeling better? Is it any
Right. Yeah.
better? Do you
Yeah.
see any
Yeah.
improvement? But I was equally irate with people who didn't check in and
Right.
who didn't ask me how I was doing. So there is a certain part of this where you have to realize as the person who's suffering that this is about you and not them. And like, if the way people are trying to saying feeling any better these days, screaming at them or lashing out or telling them to shut the fuck up, like that's not, they don't deserve, I think saying, hey, asking me specific questions or something is more helpful because I don't want to feel disappointing every time I'm telling you I'm not feeling better. So I think that's reasonable. Do you disagree with that piece of advice?
No, well, no. So I mean, I think the my broader like objection was that the degree to which this is as a whole, like to the degree to which this is like wise counsel or like instruction, it's wise because it says remember that people are suffering and they've like I mean I think actually far it's that last part like they've each developed their own idiosyncratic strategies to cope and they don't need to be told. I think like don't constantly offer other people advice about how to solve their problems that you have never dealt with because you've heard somebody once had a problem that you like. It's interesting, you were really grateful to be given a ton of advice from strangers. I often find like when people give me advice about problems, it starts to bother me, particularly if I did not invite it.
Totally.
But
I think I
but
was
I also think like
grateful
that
in,
kind
yeah,
of
sorry, go ahead.
gets to my larger concern, which is it's not just that this is not an etiquette guide to long COVID. This isn't actually about long COVID, or like the part of it that's about long COVID is her experience. What's not about long COVID is having some consideration for the fact that other people are experiencing things that are not what you're experiencing. And like, while only certain people have long COVID and only a tiny number of people proportionally have what you have, or have even broadly speaking, what you have, which is this chronic dizziness, it's 100,000, it's hundreds of thousands of people. Same thing with any number of other specific ailments, but the number of people with some ongoing ailment that's half visible, half invisible, a little
It's
idiosyncratic,
huge.
kind of difficult. Like
Yeah.
that's everybody. And so I think I sort of simultaneously think that it's a good to remind ourselves to be more considerate of others. But I actually
Yeah.
think it's maybe even counterproductive to say, ho, 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 when you encounter somebody with long COVID, don't do this, do this. Because the problem is like, we're not going out in the world saying like, oh, should I, when I encounter people with long COVID, should I ask this question or should I ask that question? We're asking ourselves like, hey, I know 150 people. They all like, I can't remember who has what. I can't remember what I last heard about each
Right.
person's thing, but I'd like to show that I care. And so like we check in with
Yeah.
each other in various ways. And like generally, I think it is good to be considerate, but I think passing around these sort of like sassy guides to like what to say and not to say to every specific type of person often just encourages people not to talk to those people because they don't like I
Right.
don't
And
remember
it's
my etiquette guide. I just remember that there is a very specific etiquette guide and they get really pissed off when you say the wrong thing. So I'm just going to avoid talking to that person. And I actually think this extends beyond like illness to like the
to
various identity
race, right?
categories, right?
Like,
Race,
right. Like,
transgender. I mean, I think like treat other
yes.
people with compassion and consideration, but also like everybody has something and it's not your thing, but we're all just trying to do like we should all actually be trying to do our best to like deal with our lives and treat each other with compassion. But like I think expecting a certain kind of like rigorous adherence to some system of etiquette that's specific to your condition is foolish and maybe harmful.
I agree with nearly all of what you said. I just some examples. I think that was what I found most off-putting about that Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility book, where
Mm.
the thesis often is that like white people shouldn't center whiteness and being white people in this culture of how hard it is to be not white. So we shouldn't ask black people to explain things to us. Instead, we should do our
Right.
own
Yeah,
homework.
yeah,
We
yeah, yeah, yeah.
shouldn't react emotionally to a difficult situation because that's asking, black and brown people to suffer from our own emotions as well as theirs. And there were all these very strict rules on
Yeah,
how
yeah, yeah.
one should or shouldn't interact with these situations. And as you say, I don't think Robin DiAngelo was looking to harm anybody, but I think that type of approach, that type of top down you shouldn't interact with certain people in these specific ways, it paralyzes the conversation. It makes
Oh
it very
yeah.
difficult to have any conversation, to the point where everyone just wants to be left alone. The way that this, I think should have been more about COVID and more COVID specific is, for example, she gives an anecdote and says the COVID was the easiest, practically asymptomatic. I walked the dog, drove 4 hours in a car, hiked the beach, canoed. This was late June. The doctors in my life should have understood that this spooky absence of symptoms was an ominous sign. My immune compromised self wasn't putting up a fight it should have. Instead, they all brushed off my concerns when I rang. To a person, they steered me away from Paxlovid. Then she continues, remember that crazy national moment when doctors were being weird about Paxlovid and we're really down on it? I cannot tell you how often I will go back to that moment and I take Paxlovid. It's the world's most unproductive form of magical thinking. So in those couple paragraphs, she implies a lot, and a lot that I would be fascinated to know. Like, is it true that lack of symptoms when you have COVID is indicative of more of a chance of getting long COVID? I don't think that's the case. I think a lot of people have no symptoms when they have COVID. And
Oh yeah.
but it seems to be that she's linking those two and saying that it should have rung alarm bells in her doctors, who should have come in and intervened immediately when she said she had no symptoms when she tested positive for COVID. Next off, it said, remember that time when people insanely didn't take Paxlovid? I am still really confused about Paxlovid. And I
Right.
know that some people don't take it because it gives them diarrhea.
Right.
Does Paxlovid prevent long COVID? Because if so, I don't think we're settled on any of this. So
No.
she implies a lot, and I think that their thing unprofessional about sort of these scattering implications in the Atlantic. And I think the Atlantic does this too often, where
Yeah. Yeah.
it makes bold statement. And I was a columnist for the Atlantic for a year, like, but
Sure.
I think the Atlantic leans towards allowing strong statements for the sake of exciting the reader without providing a lot of the background information that the reader is hungry for in these moments. So that's where I think it should have been more COVID specific. That
Yes.
said, I don't see this as an article that is written in order to provide people with an etiquette guide. I see this as an article written for what I think, in retrospect, and this helped me realize, was the same reason I wrote my articles for the New York Times, where it's a way to publish to the world, look at me, I'm suffering. I don't
Yeah.
want to need to have individual conversations with all of you about this. It's a way to
Yeah.
tell the world, like, my life is so hard right now. I mean, she
Yeah.
explicitly writes the line, um, after she goes to this party where this person wouldn't stop asking her questions about COVID. Um, Now, in the interest of time and efficiency, see my piece in the Atlantic. I'll say from now on. Herein, I
Right.
give you a condensed version of what long COVID has been like for me. So I remember that feeling, and it was liberating when I could stop telling my friends versions of
Sure.
this is the way I'm suffering and this is what makes me suffer more, and just say, go read my article in the New York Times. That served these dual goals of, one, being able to shout from the mountaintop, like, I
Right.
am hurting, come see me in pain. And it allowed me to say, like, this isn't a little thing, guys. Like, even the New York Times is letting me say how much I'm suffering. And this is the way I'm suffering. Come read it so I don't need to prove to you I'm suffering. Because another thing that a psychologist that I saw a couple bad psychologists for, but then the psychologist I saw who was really great said, like, part of what I see in you, Brian, is that you are forcing your suffering on everybody, and that, like, you don't need to do that. Like, it's not, you don't need to constantly demonstrate to everybody how much pain you're in. It doesn't benefit them, it doesn't benefit you. And that was an insight that was very useful to me. But again, now looking back at my Times pieces, I think that's sort of a writ large version of what I was doing, or a writ large isn't the right expression, an amplified version of what I was doing in my individual interaction. So that's where I see Jennifer Senior in this light now, where she's saying, I think that she's writing it as an etiquette guide, because, like, an etiquette guide to somebody who has long COVID is a little catchy, and maybe will get you some clicks, and is a little bit sort of whimsical, maybe. Whereas just saying, look at me, I'm suffering, an appropriate headline
Yeah.
for a clickbaity publication looking for more subscribers.
It's just to, I mean, I know I've said it before, like, if it were just the headline, that is a little different. I think, like, I'm going to take this jacket off. So I do think, like, maybe just because I like form and convention, it's like, all right, if you're going to do that, like, get the credit for doing that, but then go ahead and actually do a version of that. But I do
Right. And
think
I'm
that,
just saying,
yeah,
have a little bit more sympathy. Like, I think that if what she wanted to do was write an article saying, look at me, I'm suffering, she's a writer for the
they would have
Atlantic, so
published
she
it.
has a way to do that.
Yeah.
But I don't think that, I don't think that she wanted, I think that feels self-indulgent to write an
Yeah.
article saying, look at me, I'm suffering. So this is the way she's writing that article. And
Yeah.
is she writing the article she claims to be writing? No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do I sort of give her a pass? I do.
I don't know. I mean, I kind of feel like when I was in college, my friends who were waiters were the least tolerant of bad service. Um,
Sure.
they were, I mean, they also were the most generous tippers, but they were the ones who were like, no, I know how hard it is
Right.
to do that. And it's not hard. Like, that they should know
Right.
that. So I do feel like, just from a writing perspective, like, I mean, similarly to, like, I mean, that, because I think I, I totally understood what she meant in that, as you said, and saying, but in the interest of time and efficiency, see my piece in the Atlantic, I'll say from now on. I totally understood that. I mean, I guess even in the context of the podcast, I will, like, shout from the knoll top. Is a knoll like a small hill? I feel like,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, like,
Little
I definitely, I definitely understand and sympathize that with that a little bit. It
grassy.
did, to me, I think, because so much of the piece felt like, here is a thing, and she even uses the word unique at one point to describe something that's
Yeah.
completely not unique to her and to long
Totally. Well, that's
COVID.
just Jennifer senioring. I mean,
I
that
guess, yeah. I mean, well, and
that's
I guess, like, I read that the, like, writing the See My Piece in the Atlantic thing is sort of, in a way, like an extension of that same impulse to be like, let me tell you, did you know that we have to deal with depression when we have long COVID? And it's like, that sounds terrible. And like, again, like, her description of her condition is, I'm totally, my heart goes out to her. But it's all of these sort of funny conclusions and specificities. I do think she has this example of, so there's the completely, like, nakedly evil Times editor who says to her, she's like, so it, like, it all means she actually, like, owns up to including it not actually as, because it's not advice, because it couldn't apply to anyone else, because nobody else is actually this, like, wicked, but it's just gossip, and she just owns up to the fact that she's
right.
basically just, because here's an anecdote, my healthier, more
Planting a
circumspect,
seed there. Right.
yeah, my healthier, more circumspect self would have once filtered, rather than coyly starting a game of Guess Who. And so she basically saying, like, I'm going to go, like, I'm doing this to start a game of Guess Who to get subtle revenge
To
on this
fuck this guy. Because, like,
to
this guy was an
subtweet this
asshole.
guy. Yeah,
He gets to write the article. Right.
yeah.
Exactly.
But whatever. I'll share it. A few months ago, I told a higher up at the New York Times, we're talking very high altitude, just focus
Why
it in
was
a little
that in
more.
there? I think the reason that was included was to narrow the scope of potential
Oh, no,
people
I think that's exactly
from
why. That was
10 to
exactly why.
4. I think
Well,
that
I think,
she
yeah,
wants this.
yeah, it's to narrow the
Yeah. I
scope,
think she
and
wants
to
this person.
clarify that she's definitely punching up, right? I think she wants to make sure it's
Right.
not
Right.
understood. Yeah. But no, I think that's
But
exactly
I think
why.
she wants the person to read this article and know, like, or somebody
She
pointing
thinks
out,
she
like
wants
somebody
people
at
who
dinner
know him
saying,
to read it.
was this you, honey? Right.
Yes.
Like, I
Yeah,
think
I think that's exactly what she wants.
she
Yeah.
is doing as a way to enter and then twist the knife.
No, yeah, this is an exercise of personal vendetta here, which is actually perfect.
Exactly.
Like,
It's vengeance.
totally enjoyable.
Yeah, which I kind of like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She says, I told a higher up at the New York Times that I've been struggling with long COVID. His reply, is that the excuse everyone at the Atlantic uses when they're unproductive? I mean, she then comments on that, but, like, it's just so over the top. It's like, again, like, the only reason to include it is just to, like try to, like, tar this guy's reputation, which, like, good luck with that. I hope it works. Because that's, like, just an unthinkably horrible thing to say.
It's a very strange thing. It's a terrible thing to say. It's also, it implies all of these other microaggressions that, like, even who, like, my wife, like, ran product for the Atlantic and now is doing a similar job for the Times, and I've written for the Times and the Atlantic, and I have no idea what he's implying about the Atlantic there. Like, it's not a thing that Atlantic writers are always making excuses about laziness. Is it? Maybe it is. Like,
it's like when people are racist in, like, confusing, inconsistent ways.
Right.
Like,
you
nobody lazy
will
Jews.
Get, like,
that's, well, what?
Right, exactly.
Is that a thing that we believe?
Right. That's why all you black people are good at math, And it's like, well, I
Right,
don't,
yeah, like,
I
I'm
mean, they're not
offended, but I'm
bad at
not
math.
sure.
Is it
Yeah.
that they're good? Is that I definitely am right. This is a terrible thing to have said. I'm not quite sure I understand it, sir.
Yeah. So I mean, like
Right.
I enjoyed that just as pure gossip, which is I think what it was. I think in a way like more useful. And like here's the thing, that is an example of an actual microaggression. If like if a macroaggression is like punching someone, then a
Right.
microaggression is deliberately saying
Like
something hurtful to
being really
somebody.
mean.
Right. Like
Right.
that's an
Right.
actual microaggression. What we typically call
Well, I
microaggressions,
actually I would push
you
back a
probably
little bit.
disagree with
I
me on
think
this.
well, I don't think I disagree with you. I think the word microaggression is still in its nascent like definable time where I think some people would say the definition of a microaggression is unintentionally demonstrating
Right.
a hierarchy of values,
And I
right?
would say
Where if
that makes it a
a
nonsensical term.
microaggression I sure
Yeah.
maybe it's nonsensical, but I think that like a microaggression as you're using it is sort of etymological. Like aggression is aggressive and micro is small. So
Right.
like a
If it means
macroaggression would be
something,
hitting
that's
you
what
in
it
the
ought to
eye,
mean.
and a
Yeah.
microaggression would be like flicking you in the nose.
Sure.
Where I think that what it means when people use it most often is an aggression that was perhaps not intended to piss people off,
Right.
but that demonstrates something about that person's worldview which pisses people off.
Right. And I would say that's definitely something to be aware of. It's a phenomenon that we should think more about and that is worth addressing and correcting. It's also not aggression. So it's just not well named. But I do think like sort
Right.
of
I agree with
that
you. I
to that
not
yeah
it's not aggression.
to
Right.
that point, because what it is really is a is thoughtlessness, is a
Yes,
slight,
exactly.
is failing to consider the other person's perspective. And so like my thought was that the actual
Unintentional aggression. I think aggression needs. Do you think inherent in the word aggression is that it's intentional?
yeah,
Because
I
what if
think
instead of microaggression, the term was unintentional aggression, where you're being aggressive towards somebody insofar as you are aggressing? I guess I don't really understand the word.
well, here's as somebody who has been extremely bad at body language my whole life. I mean, since I was a kid, I've been told I was being aggressive when I was, I mean, not even not being aggressive, like talking abstractly about something I was excited about, in a way that,
Right.
like, I just think it's a totally meaningless use of the term. I do think aggression needs to be in some capacity intentional. Maybe it's not
Okay.
like a conscientious, like it may not need to be premeditated, but it does have to be in some
Right.
sense intentional. Otherwise we're just talking about a different thing. Like there's a I'm
But
you know
what if I'm playing football before school with my kid and I'm having a catch with him and like
yeah,
it's a time when everybody is like quietly lined up, but like I'm a big boisterous dad and
yeah, sure,
I'm like sort of obnoxiously like having a catch with my kid and then like I'm
sure,
throwing it wilder and wilder and then the kid catches it and in so doing like runs over a littler kid. That
yeah,
that seems like
that's
aggression,
you're doing two different
right?
things
Like
though, because
that's
you're talking about you getting like playfully aggressive and then your kid like being unaware of where his body is.
But what if my purpose in throwing it isn't to be aggressive? It's just to give my kid like a harder catch.
Fine. Like, I mean, what I'm saying is like you are muddying the waters by talking about your own condition here. What we're really talking about is your kid wasn't aware of where he was running and he stepped on a kid, and that's painful and he should be more aware. But that's not aggression. That's just accidentally hurting someone and like being carelessly hurting someone, negligently hurting someone.
Right. And I guess I'm just saying that carelessly hurting someone
It's still
and
hurting someone.
accidental aggression are just two different bad terms for the same topic term that is now
I don't know.
microaggression.
I think like hurting someone is like a description of an effect, right? And so
Right.
you can say deliberately hurting someone, accidentally hurting, like that. Those are meaningful clarifications. Aggression describes
But if
an
we have a
emotion.
definition, but if we have the definition of a term microaggression, which means accidentally insulting people, you just think it's a bad term. You don't think that it
I
doesn't
think it's a
mean
bad
that
and
in common
confusing term. I
parlance.
think it's a confusing term, right? The same way that
I agree with that.
like
Yeah.
it
It's a term
became
that
sort
needs
of
to be
fashionable for
explained. Yeah.
people to say that's really aggro of you, like, which
Yeah, that's
sometimes is
terrible.
describing,
Yeah.
right. It's terrible abbreviation, but
Okay.
it also is just like it's just bad use of language that doesn't. Again, like I like slang, I like innovative language, but I don't especially like language that like shuts down distinctions. So
Right. And
it,
actually, to argue your point further,
sure.
calling it a microaggression does imply more blame than maybe the microaggressor sometimes deserves. Where if the microaggressor is doing it out of ignorance, then that person can just be
Yeah.
told, hey, you accidentally offended some people when you did this. If you say you're a microaggressor, that implies that the person is doing it on purpose, and telling them, hey, you offended these people, be useless because they already have a sense of that or something like that. So you've won me to your side, I think,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
keep
Well,
going.
well, and I'll say I tend to be like, my sympathies are such that when I hear things like intention doesn't matter, I tend to think like two sides of that. Like on the one hand, I think, well, intention does matter because it is a thing. But then on the other hand, I think that effect matters maybe more than we give it credit for. So that she gives I think the less entertaining but much more useful example she gives, if we're talking about etiquette, she says, don't ask what it's like to have long COVID, at least not with the naked prurience of one that one. I think I may have stolen that phrase from her in describing my sister in law, naked prurience. Don't ask what it's like to have long COVID, at least not with the naked prurience that one professional acquaintance of mine recently did when I made the mistake of briefly dropping in on a colleague's book party. She cornered me and wouldn't stop with her Gatling gun questions, even when I told her the room was too loud and speaking hurt my head. Just one more thing, she kept saying. No more things, I said as I backed toward the door. And I think like that's not a perfect example, because it seems like there's something like either this person was really, really tone deaf or was sort of deliberately being obnoxious. And she sort of pairs cunningly a fairly curt response with a passive and retreating body language. So it's sort of, she makes it unclear exactly what the exchange was like. But what I take from that, and like, which I feel, which I take also from my own experience, is that people tend to hurt one another's feelings most often inadvertently by being thoughtless, by being
Yeah.
inconsiderate, which is a bad thing. It's not the same as being aggressive.
Yes.
But I would say, on the one hand, like when somebody says something shitty and inconsiderate to you, it's most likely that that's done innocently, right? It still is done and maybe shouldn't be done. They should be more thoughtful about what they say, but it's done probably innocently. But on the other hand, I think if someone says something that is effectively incredibly rude to you, it's okay to answer rudely. Like I think I
Yeah.
totally understand when people say, there are things people say to me all the time that are so shitty in these funny little ways that never occurred to them at all. And my thought is like, I get that they aren't meaning to be mean, but if they say something the effect of which is so shitty, it's okay for me to respond in like a curt way that makes them uncomfortable. And maybe that will, like,
Yeah. I
maybe that will be instructive, or maybe it'll just be cathartic for me, or maybe it'll just end the conversation.
Right. But if you were my kid or my student, I would say there's really no benefit of you being impolite or curt or mean in that moment at all. You should be constructive in some way, right? Like you should say, it hurt me when you said that, and then walk away. I don't think I think that grown adult, especially men,
Yeah.
don't really have a vocabulary for saying it hurt me when you said that. But I do feel like that's the more useful response, where there's never a reason to be rude and dismissive back, is there, other than catharsis?
Uh, I mean, I I think, well, so okay, so here's maybe where this is where it applies to, beyond COVID symptoms or whatever. Because these kinds of guides come out in varying contexts for any of the different identity groups that we are concerned with. My student wrote like a very thoughtful, I didn't totally agree with it, like a very thoughtful guide for neurotypical children and their parents on how to address and respond to autistic children and their parents. And
Sure.
like, and there are these guides for all sorts of categories and groups and whatever. And I think on the one hand, like, it is maybe not very productive in that nobody is going to keep all this shit straight. And it discourages people from having conversations with people they know are in some category different from them. But on the other hand, I'm totally sympathetic to women, Black people, trans people, et cetera, who say, I'm sick of explaining this. It shouldn't be on me to tell you why you're being an asshole. I'm totally sympathetic to that. I guess I extend that sympathy to myself when it comes to any of the things that like people say that are like truly are really shitty things to say, but that don't occur to them as such. Like my response is that it probably in a perfect world, I would every time someone said something shitty, I would either grin and bear it or I would stop, think compassionately, and respond and make it a teachable moment. But that's incredibly exhausting. And so I guess what I'm saying is like you can let yourself off the hook. You don't have to like we don't need to assume evil and wickedness and aggression every time someone says something shitty, but you also don't need to take every one of those moments as a teaching opportunity. You can just
I totally
blow
agree.
that
Except
person off and
the
leave.
only all I was pushing back about was that I don't think that is ever the right response. I don't think I think of course you can let yourself off the hook for it, and it's a socially acceptable. It's not a condemnable response necessarily, but I don't correct a response ever.
I think it's an okay. I think it's a fine response. Like I mean, maybe there's a difference between. I guess like I see in this in Aristotelian terms. Like there are like actively destructive, like definitely condemnable responses. There are laudable, saintly responses, and then there's like the range of fine, the range of like that's totally fine. And I would say, not escalating the rudeness, but like responding in a curt, dismissive way is in the range of fine response. It's not the saintly thing, but it's fine.
That's interesting. I don't think saying "go fuck yourself"
I think
fine.
saying go fuck yourself is almost always going to be escalating, right? I would say
Right.
you can be curt
So
and
what are you? So give
dismissive.
me an example. Then maybe.
I think so.
So you're
Did
at a
I
restaurant
told you the thing
alone
about
or with your
my neighbor and the projector? I can't remember if I said this to you or not.
well, whether you me or not, the audience probably doesn't know about it.
I
So
don't know. I may, and I
go
have
for it.
so much shit in the can right now, but let me think of maybe a different example. Okay. So I was talking to somebody who was telling me a story about third party people I don't know. And the story was about a bad marriage that became a bad divorce. And in the story, the dad worked traveling abroad, and the mom stayed at home with the kid, and another kid she had had from a previous marriage, and she had lots of problems. And they'd split up, and he had in a bad moment had signed an agreement that was really onerous to him, and like he was giving her a lot of money, maybe more than he should have, and he sort of he had like his rights were very restricted in ways that sort of probably were not fair. And the account I was getting was that this guy was in a bad situation and he was being taken advantage of, and I think probably that was true based on everything I knew about it. But the exchange was, well, he's working and so he's supporting them financially, right? The mom who's living with his kid and a kid
Gotcha.
from another
Yep.
marriage, and she's getting whatever payments from him, alimony, what like all the very child support, etc. And the comment was, I said, so what is she doing? And she said, well, she's taking care of the kids. And then the follow up was, so she's not contributing anything. Like
I
he's
see.
paying
All
for
right.
everything and
So
she's not
that
contributing anything. And so that's such an obviously shitty response that completely disregards all the work
yes,
of taking care of kids, that I think like I wouldn't say go fuck
go
yourself in
fuck
response to
yourself.
that. But I
Right.
think it would be, I think like my actual response was to grin and bear it. And I think that's
Right.
fine. I don't think that should be necessary. I think you could like make that an elaborate teachable moment, and maybe that's the saintly response.
Right.
But I think also fine would be, well, that's kind of a shitty thing to say. Or like, I gotta go.
What's interesting about right? So that's kind of a shitty thing to say. But I think that that's so interesting that those are your two examples, because that's kind of a shitty thing to say makes it a teachable moment, and oh, I gotta go is grinning and bearing it. I'm curious about what the like
I think
slight
I think
pushback.
well, so I think the what based on my own experience, because I've given a response of this type, this like I am irritated by what you just said and I'm leaving, and people get extremely upset by that because they know that what's implied is that they did something wrong and you're not telling
Right.
them what. And like, and
Right.
my thought is like, well, if I don't feel like, if I don't have the energy to like make this a teachable moment, like I'm going to let it be on you to figure that out. And I think like
Totally.
that I would say that's not a particularly aggressive response, people get even more upset by that than if you just openly say, fuck you. If you say, like,
Great.
that sucks what you
That
just
makes
said,
sense.
and I'm leaving, like, is so upsetting to people. And I think, in the same way that, like, probably people say things like that without at all, I mean, in a totally innocent way, they're still responsible for the effect it had. And, like, you're not always responsible for teaching them. So I think that's the way in which I weirdly split this baby.
No, well said. That makes sense. I want to return to naked prurience before we get
Yeah.
to Fetterman. I don't have it up in front of me, but the definition of prurience is like sexual or like darkly sexual or like selfishly sexual. Is that what prurience means?
So
Or like
I'm getting, actually,
lewd
you know
or
what, I
what?
learned, I've noticed recently that the American Heritage Dictionary, which proudly presents etymologies, often presents false etymologies, or will say origin unknown when the origin is very much known. So so I'm gonna ignore that for a second. I'm gonna look
So
this
I'm
up.
on Merriam-Webster that says it's the act of being prurient, and prurient means marked by or arousing an immoderate or wholesome interest or desire, especially sexual desire.
Immoderate or unwholesome, I
So
assume it says.
yes,
Yeah, yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
Immoderate or unwholesome
yeah.
sexual desire.
And the
So,
looks like the root is Latin for itch. Like, you're
oh,
scratching
that's
an itch. You're
interesting.
scratching an itch by
Yeah,
asking this or by looking into this, which is, I guess, where we get the kind
which
of, like,
is like
sexual
animal,
implication.
right? Like,
Yeah, like, you're responding to a like a base urge.
so what do you make of putting the word naked there is a funny word as a modifier because
Yeah,
naked read like one's gut when reading naked prurience is to just make the prurience more sexual, but the actual use of naked I think is like unhidden, like an open prurience is what
yeah,
she's because
yes,
she's
yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
talking about sexuality. So she's
Right.
using the word naked to amplify a sexually charged term sexually,
Yeah,
but not looking for a sexual connotation.
right. I think she's using
So that's
naked.
bad writing, right?
Well, I think it's bad rating in the same way that her including that anecdote about the New York Times editor is bad rating. Like, I think it's I like it because basically it's
So do I.
the
I like it
denotation
too.
serves a functional purpose, and the connotation is revenge. That was this week's show. Thank you all for listening. If you would like to hear the second half, in which we get into another Jen Senior article that is sort of obliquely related, maybe unintentionally related to the first one, also pretty interesting but fairly weird, then you go to sleeverickets.substack.com and sign up for the secret show, or just stick your email address in there to get a week's access for free. We do almost unavoidably get into politics a little bit, so if you are extra excited to be infuriated by our lackluster commitment to progressive values and or rabidly irresponsible promotion of said values, then check it out now. Thank you again, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.